In a story, everyone loves a good duel, whether it has emotional impact or whether it's just two badass characters going up against each other because why not? If done well, it's almost always one of the most memorable parts of a story. I mean, just look at the Iliad. Thousands of years later, and even if you haven't read the story, you probably still know about Hector vs Achilles. So in this video, I'm going to go through some of the most iconic duels in Middle-earth's history, whether it was in terms of impact to the story, or just the sheer epicness of the moment. I'm going to start with what I probably believe is the most epic duel in Middle-earth's history. In terms of impact on the story, this duel was fairly limited, but it made for an amazing moment of despairing defiance nevertheless. I want you to take a few moments to think about what it might be. If you're thinking High King Fingolfin versus Morgoth himself, then you're absolutely correct. In 455 of the First Age, Morgoth unleashed his long-prepared assault, the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. The Siege of Angband was broken, and over the course of that year, Morgoth won victory after victory, and it seemed like the Elves and the Edain were finished. Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, looked upon this defeat in despair, and perhaps in a moment of madness, decided that if he was to go down, then he might as well try and take Morgoth with him. He rode alone to the gates of Angband in such a fury that the armies of Morgoth simply stepped aside, and he challenged the Dark Lord to single combat. Fearful of looking like a coward in front of his lieutenants, Morgoth accepted and came forth. The outcome of the battle was never really in doubt. Morgoth was a gigantic figure, a literal god, even though he was weaker at this point, and Fingolfin, as valiant and skilled as he was just an elf. But that being said, Fingolfin gave a brilliant account of himself, wounding Morgoth 7 different times. Morgoth's victory only came when an exhausted Fingolfin stumbled in one of the many craters that Morgoth's giant hammer, Grond, had left upon the surface. Morgoth took this moment to crush Fingolfin with his foot, but in his final moments, Fingolfin stabbed Morgoth in the foot with his sword, rendering him with a permanent limp. Fearful of his own weakness, Morgoth would never issue forth to battle again, and when he was finally overthrown during the War of Wrath, he was found hiding in the deepest pits of Angband. Another battle that rivals the duel of Fingolfin and Morgoth in sheer epicness is a battle that occurs in the Lord of the Rings, none other than Gandalf versus Durin's Bane, the Balrog. We see a glimpse of this fight in the Fellowship of the Ring, where both individuals attempt to counter each other with different spells before leading to a confrontation on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. Gandalf succeeds in causing the Balrog to fall into the abyss, only for Durin's Bane to take Gandalf with him. But this is only the start. For the next 3 days, the two would engage in a running battle, starting from the depths of the world where not even the dwarves had explored, to the very peak of Celebdil, the Silvertine. This is the only time where Gandalf would unleash his full power, fighting against a being of equal stature, and the effects were devastating. During the fight, the legendary Durin's Tower was destroyed, and the equally legendary Durin's Stair was blocked by debris. Atop Celebdil, Durin's Bane was finally killed, and his body broke the mountainside when he fell. However, Gandalf also died, likely due to the exhaustion and injuries that his mortal body had sustained. But of course, that's not where Gandalf's story ended. In honour of his sacrifice, Iluvatar would reincarnate him as the more powerful Gandalf the White. While not as epic as the last two duels, the next duel, which also appears in the Lord of the Rings, deserves a place due to its impact on the battle it took place in, and because it fulfilled a 1,000-year-long prophecy. I'm of course talking about Éowyn versus the Witch King. During the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Theoden was crushed beneath his horse after it was struck by a dart, and the Witch King, atop his fell beast, swept in to finish him off. All of the king's bodyguards fled, except for a single warrior, Dernhelm, who was soon revealed to be Éowyn, the king's niece. Like I said, the duel itself isn't particularly epic. It's one-sided. Éowyn demonstrates how brave she is, and shows skill when she manages to decapitate the Witch King's fell beast, but the Witch King immediately shatters her shield and breaks her arm with a single stroke of his mace. Éowyn then would have died if not for the assistance of Merry, who stabbed the Witch King in the knee, allowing for Éowyn to rally and stab him in the face, finally ridding the world of him. But its impact on the battle should not be understated. The Witch King's will and terror played a massive part in holding the Morgul host together, and his death marked a turning point in the battle. Gothmog, the new commander, would throw in all available reserves, meaning that when Aragorn arrived shortly afterwards with his forces from the south, the Morgul host could not react adequately, and the loss of his most powerful servant would spook Sauron for the remainder of the war. Speaking of Sauron, he was actually involved in 3 legendary duels, 2 in the First Age and 1 in the Second Age. In the First Age, from his corrupted island stronghold of Tol in Galahoth, Sauron managed to capture Beren, Finrod Felagund, and their companions who had undertaken the quest for the Silmaril. The first of these duels was actually a magical duel between Sauron and Finrod. How exactly this worked is unknown, but despite giving a good account of himself, Finrod was defeated and he and his companions were imprisoned, left to the mercy of Sauron's werewolves. There's actually another epic duel during this event, if you can call it that, where Finrod actually breaks his bonds to save Beren and takes on a werewolf with his bare hands. Both would be dead by the end of the fight. But Sauron's role in the story is not yet done. Luthien and the wolfhound Huan arrive to save Beren, and Sauron sends his werewolves after them. Huan kills every single one of them. There's actually a prophecy about Huan where it's said that he will only be killed by the greatest wolf that has ever lived. Sauron, cunning as he is, tries to fulfill the prophecy and shapeshifts into a massive wolf, but he can't trick it, and after a fight, Huan defeats him and has him at his mercy. Unable to do anything else, Sauron shapeshifts into a vampire bat and flees the scene. 3,000 years later, and Sauron would once again find himself in a life or death situation. The War of the Last Alliance had been raging for 12 years, and the last 7 years had seen Sauron physically besieged inside his fortress of Barad-dûr. In a final attempt to break the siege, Sauron himself sallied forth, and had initial success. The Last Alliance was driven back, but on the slopes of Mount Doom, Sauron was confronted by Elendil and Gil-galad, the 2 leaders of the Last Alliance, the High King of Gondor and Arnor, and the High King of the Noldor. Also present was Elrond, Círdan, and Isildur, but none of them took part in the fight. Our details about the battle are scant. Sauron, in the form of a Dark Lord, a towering figure larger than a man, but not gigantic, took on Elendil and Gil-galad at the same time. Gil-galad was wielding his spear, Aeglos, and Elendil, an imposing figure of almost 8 feet tall, was wielding Narsil. At some point in the battle, Gil-galad is caught in Sauron's grip and is burned to death from the heat of Sauron's hand. Ouch. Elendil, on the other hand, seems to have been hit by a massive blunt force, strong enough to cause him to fall upon Narsil, breaking it to pieces. But during the fight, Sauron had been mortally wounded, and seemingly lived just long enough for Isildur to cut the One Ring from his hand. Although Sauron would rise again, it's the last time he would take part in a physical fight. I want to scale things back a bit, because almost all the duels I've talked about so far have involved divine beings, but this next duel is one between mortal men, and that's the duel of Eldacar versus Castamir during the Gondorian Kinstrife Civil War. Although it's sort of just a footnote in history, and although we don't know anything about the actual duel itself, this was an incredibly important confrontation. It would help decide the fate of the Kingdom of Gondor, and was the end of a huge personal rivalry. Upon ascending to the throne of Gondor in 1432, Eldacar immediately faced an uprising led by Castamir, his distant cousin, on the basis that Eldacar was half Northman and therefore not exactly worthy for the throne. 5 years later, Eldacar was defeated and was forced to flee Osgiliath, which was sacked, and his eldest son, Ornendil, was needlessly executed. Eldacar would spend 10 years in exile in Rhovanion before returning at the head of an army of loyalists. At the Battle of the Crossing of Erwi, Eldacar and Castamir would face off, and at some point in the battle, Eldacar would personally kill the usurper. Castamir's sons and followers would flee to Umbar, establishing a rival realm, but Eldacar would regain his throne. I want you to put yourself in Eldacar's shoes for a moment. When he killed Castamir upon the battlefield, it must have been the sweetest revenge someone could have. This man had stolen his kingdom, sacked his capital city, and executed his son. And all of this was on the pretense that Eldacar's Northman blood somehow made him inferior to Castamir. Eldacar proved that wrong in the most cathartic way possible. And if this duel had gone differently, if Castamir had won, Gondor would have taken a very different path during the Third Age, and who could say how things would have ended up. There's also another duel I want to talk about that's also sort of just a footnote in history, and that is the duel between Celegorm and King Dior of Doriath during the second kinslaying in the First Age. Dior was the son of Beren and Luthien, and had ascended to the throne of a weakened Doriath after the murder of King Thingol. Notably, Dior also had a Silmaril in his possession, the reward of the sacrifice of his parents. Unfortunately, this got the attention of the Sons of Feanor, who had sworn an oath to reclaim the Silmarils, whether it be from friend or foe. Diplomacy quickly failed. Celegorm, who was probably the most belligerent of the Sons of Feanor, stirred up his brothers, and in 506 of the First Age, they launched a surprise attack on Doriath. The second kinslaying was a brutal affair and a victory for the Feanorians, but the Silmaril once again eluded them, escaping around the neck of Éowyn, Dior's young daughter. Although Dior, his wife Nimloth, and his two twin sons, Elured and Elurin, would perish during the battle or shortly afterwards, Dior would experience a brief moment of victory. During the battle, he confronted Celegorm, the true mastermind behind the attack, and managed to kill him before being killed himself. Although power ran through the veins of Dior, in reality, he was just a 36-year-old man who had lived a life of peace. He had little combat experience, and in his final moments, he managed to kill Celegorm, a millennia-old elf who was a veteran of countless battles. Talk about an upset. The next duel I want to talk about is a duel that should receive far more recognition than it does, and that's the duel between Ecthelion, Lord of the Fountain, versus Gothmog, Lord of the Balrogs. In the Silmarillion, this fight is a mere footnote, but in the Fall of Gondolin, despite its dubious place in the canon, we get much greater detail. During the event of the Fall of Gondolin, the army of Gondolin fought desperately. Pushed from the walls, they retreated house by house, street by street, facing endless hordes of orcs, accompanied by dragons, and of course, Balrogs. During this retreat, Ecthelion was badly wounded, his left arm was useless, so he could no longer use a shield, and he was soon carried from the fighting by Tuor. The army of Gondolin made a final stand in the Square of the King. During this fight, Gothmog faced off with Agalmoth, Lord of the Heavenly Arch, and defeated him, but before he could kill him, the badly wounded Ecthelion intervened. During this fight, Ecthelion took a wound to his other hand and could no longer hold his sword. Gothmog, thinking himself victorious, raised his whip for a final blow, but Ecthelion suddenly charged forward and drove his helm into the Balrog's chest. His helm was spiked. Wrapping his legs around the Balrog, Ecthelion used the momentum to drive them both into the Fountain of the King. Weighed down by his steel armor, Ecthelion sank, and Gothmog was unable to free himself. They would both drown there. This duel is also made awesome by the fact that up until this point, Gothmog was a survivor and a massive thorn in the side of the Noldor. He would usually command Morgoth's armies and had faced off against many deadly foes. He had stood against Feanor, and together with his fellow Balrogs, had mortally wounded the legendary elven leader. He had also faced off against High King Fingon during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, but this duel was cut short when a second Balrog intervened, immobilizing Fingon long enough for Gothmog to land a killing blow. But against Ecthelion, he was all alone, and even when Ecthelion could no longer fight properly, he used an unconventional tactic to make sure the Lord of the Balrogs finally met his deserved end. I kind of wanted this to be the last duel of the video, but it wouldn't be fair to mention the fight between Ecthelion and Gothmog without mentioning the fight that took place shortly afterwards, between Glorfindel and another unnamed Balrog. After the fall of Gondolin, Idril and Tuor led the survivors through a treacherous mountain path away from the city, and although things initially looked promising, they were soon ambushed by a company of orcs led by a Balrog. With most of the remaining lords of Gondolin dead or wounded, Glorfindel, Lord of the Golden Flower, stepped up and engaged the Balrog, while a group of eagles led by Thorondor took care of the orcs. Although the refugees were saved, the duel ended in a draw, with both Glorfindel and the Balrog falling to their deaths from a pinnacle. For his heroic sacrifice, Glorfindel was fast-tracked through the halls of Mandos and would be reincarnated, eventually returning to Middle-earth in the Second Age, where he would continue to do good. Of course, there are many other epic and famous duels throughout Middle-earth's history: Éomer vs Ugluk, Theoden vs the Black Serpent of Harad, Tuor vs Maiglin, and Calagon vs Eärendil, and Turin vs Glaurung, if you can call them duels, and Smeagol vs Deagol. Okay, maybe not so much that last one. But the ones I've spoken about are my favourite, and I think that's enough for the time being. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. Fun fact about this extra, I'm actually recording it like a week later because I totally forgot to record it. I wrote it down, I just forgot about it and didn't record it for some reason. I don't know why. Anyway, for the longest time, I've been planning on doing a video listing some of Middle-earth's greatest warriors, but at the last second, this idea hit me, and I decided to run with it instead, as it's probably much less controversial. That being said, that video is definitely still in the pipeline. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you want to duel someone, pick a child.